guess I'll go first. I go by SphincterOfDoom. I was a nuclear technician in the Navy. Afterwards, I got my degree in chemical engineering, and after that, I worked in industrial gases, mainly producing cryogenic atmospheric gases.
Well, I go by the name of Nestek20, but you can call me Nes for short. And related to this topic, I made a video about nuclear power once, which is one of my only videos on this on my channel. So if you are interested, check it out.
Last but not least.
And I'm Dapper Dino. I've got a channel, mostly talk about evolution, paleontology, debunking creationism, usually young Earth, but not always. And I was also a nuclear technician in the U.S. Navy, and that's why I'm here to talk about some nuclear power stuff.
If I remember my terms correctly, the nuclear power, they use fission, not fusion, right?
Yes. Yeah, give it 10 years and we'll have fusion, I'm sure.
That's what they said 10 years ago, too.
That's what they said like 50 years ago, man. We've been 10 years away from fusion reactors for decades.
I've always heard it from particle physicists that fusion is 50 years away and always will be.
And that's the power the sun uses.
The power of the sun in the palm of my hand.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the reason why it's so difficult for us is that the sun kind of cheats with gravity, and the temperatures inside fusion reactors on Earth are an order of magnitude hotter than at least the surface of the sun, because you have to overcome the Coulomb barrier, the electromagnetic or electrostatic forces that are keeping the nuclei opposed. And since you can't cheat with gravity, you got to add more heat.
He'd have to heat the cube to 120 million Kelvin just to break through the Coulomb barrier.
Unless Selvig has figured out how to stabilize the quantum tunneling effect.
Well, if he could do that, he could achieve heavy ion fusion at any reactor on the planet.
Finally, someone who speaks English.
Is that what just happened?
Fission is easy. Fission is really easy. Even there was actually a natural fission reactor that occurred on somewhere in West Africa, where over 1 billion years ago there was a highly enriched uranium deposit that went critical for a few 100,000 years.
So criticality is in nuclear physics. It essentially means that however many neutrons are being produced from the fission are being used up in the fission reaction to create fission, are also the same number of neutrons that are being created from the fission reaction. So it's a steady state kind of thing. So when you start up, you have to be super critical. You have to actually make more neutrons than are being used. And once you reach the point that you want to be at, then you bring in the rods to be steady state. If you want to do a controlled shutdown, then you bring the rods in even further, so then you're subcritical. If there's some sort of accident where the core might get too hot, then there's various safety mechanisms as well as manual intervention to scram the reactor, where you basically release the clamps on it, and they're usually magnetic clamps. And then gravity will bring it down. But often springs assist in the speed.
You think people don't like nuclear energy because of that Chernobyl thing 20 years ago or 30 years ago at this point? That's the reason people don't like it, or other reasons?
3 Mile Island happened before Chernobyl, and so the public perception of nuclear power in the U.S. was definitely on a souring trajectory before Chernobyl. Chernobyl was just kind of a second blow. Fukushima definitely was really bad timing because we were kind of expanding. There's a nuclear renaissance, some people were saying. But the problem is that Chernobyl was the worst nuclear disaster in human history.
Of course, before nuclear power, you had nuclear weapons, and that is actually the first thing that people have associated with the word nuclear.
It's still the case that people think that you could do something to a nuclear power plant to make it explode like an atomic bomb, which you can't.
No.
The only way to make a nuclear power plant explode is to pack it with explosives. And then it's not really the power plant that's exploding, you're just making explosions inside the power plant with explosives.
The main reason why this can't happen, or at least one of the main reasons, is that nuclear fuel is about 5 to 9%. High purity nuclear fuel is still only 9% uranium-235, whereas nuclear fuel for weapons is 40 to 80%. There's just not enough fissionable material to create that. But there's other reasons too, just beyond the design of the plant.
Was it just because that country at the time, was it Russia or something, that they didn't have they were very safe or something, they didn't care about safety?
Well, it's a combination of a few things. One is that their reactor design, which used graphite. The thing with graphite is that as it gets hotter, it gets better at capturing and then re-releasing neutrons. And when that happens, the neutron is released at a lower energy. And these are the neutrons that are most likely to cause fission. So, of course, as your power goes up, that means more fission is happening because that's how you're getting your power, which is then heating up your graphite, which then means more neutrons get captured, which means your power goes up, which means your temperature goes up, which means your graphite gets warmer, and it's a positive feedback loop.
There was also another positive feedback loop caused by water. Like water is like in the graphite moderated reactor, it's a poison. It absorbs neutrons, so it will slow down reaction. But when it heats up, when it's steam, it becomes less neutron absorbent, and then it will speed up the reaction. So another positive feedback loop.
Now, the way you control this in a reactor like this is you have something loaded with what's called a poison, which basically will absorb neutrons and then not re-emit them. All of this adds up to basically, if you're not careful with this reactor design, it will just get hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter until basically it runs out of fuel.
Now, the RMBK reactor did have safety systems integrated, but what happened with Chernobyl was they were going to the reactor is particularly unstable in trying to control at lower powers, so they were trying to devise another way of operating that gave you more control. But to test that, they had to override the safeties, and then the morning crew was briefed thoroughly, but then there was lots of delays, and it ended up going to the swing shift, and they didn't get a proper briefing, and then things unsurprisingly did not go as planned. There's a massive radioactive steam explosion, blew the top off the reactor vessel. There was no containment dome. The force was so much it actually atomized what was expelled, just spreading basically radioactive dust.
Like in the most reactors that we have now today, they use water as both the coolant and also the moderator. The water slows down the neutrons. So in that case, when the water boils, it doesn't slow down the neutrons anymore, and you have a negative feedback loop. The Chernobyl reactor, the moderator was the graphite, and that means that the water is only a coolant and also a poison. So that's the main difference between the reactor at Chernobyl and the reactors that we have today.
As far as I know, all currently operating reactors have the opposite effect. As modern reactors get hot, they actually self-correct and limit their own power because the warmer they get, the worse they are at thermalizing neutrons. Which means in order to get them to melt like that, you have to do things to them. You have to remove cooling, or you have to completely withdraw your control rods, which are usually made of some kind of poison material for the reactor. Things like that. You have to do something actively. You can't just ignore your warnings and then it will melt.
It was much more unstable, and then further compounding the fact was that the government was like, everything's fine, so they didn't evacuate. The firefighters were neither properly equipped nor trained to deal with this kind of issue.
It's an important point to remember. Chernobyl was really the perfect storm of bad design, bad practices, and also a series of bad decisions that made this accident possible to begin with.
I have long argued that the conditions for Chernobyl didn't exist in Western reactors back then, and they certainly don't exist now. It just can't happen.
Is that different from the 3 Mile Island you talked about earlier?
What happened in 3 Mile Island was basically the core damage that occurred was because the core got exposed. It was no longer covered in water. So what happened is that there was a relief valve that was stuck open, but the state of the relief valve was not directly indicated on their boards. It was solenoid operated, so it was only indicated that whether the solenoid was energized or not. So the operators, it seemed as if the relief valve was shut based on the condition of the solenoid, but their water level in the reactor vessel was going down. So they were fighting conflicting indications for hours until the new shift came on, and then realized, hey, we should look at this. By then, it had basically expelled a lot of radioactive coolant, mostly into one of the other spaces on site, but some of it went into the atmosphere. But 3 Mile Island really only exposed people for about the equivalent of a chest X-ray within 10 miles.
Despite being the worst nuclear incident on U.S. soil by a lot, it also harmed essentially no one.
The reason why 3 Mile Island resonated with people so much is that 10 days before that, the China Syndrome, a disaster movie based on a nuclear accident, had come out. And the China Syndrome was the conditions that led up to the disaster were somewhat similar to 3 Mile Island, and that you lost cooling and people didn't know, and there were conflicting indications. But China Syndrome was, it's going to get so hot it's going to melt down through the earth to China, which isn't at all what would happen.
Jesus Christ! We're burning me water! God damn it!
After 3 Mile Island, Jane Fonda decided to go around the country and extolling the vices and the horrors of nuclear power while also promoting her movie.
Yes.
I want to just say a few words about the China Syndrome, my movie, The China Syndrome, because if we continue to place our health and safety in the hands of utility executives whose main goal in life is to maximize profits, then we will see more Harrisburgs, we will see more leaks, and we will see an increase in the cancer epidemic that is already running rampant in this country.
I hate Jane Fonda to this day, just because. And Fukushima, a lot like there was a somewhat similar. Like there was an explosion inside the vessel, and like there was radioactive material released. But Fukushima had a containment vessel, so a lot of the really more dangerous radioactive stuff, like strontium-90, didn't get released to the atmosphere. But no, so Fukushima, deaths associated with the accident, the nuclear accident itself, no one died from the explosion or anything like that. There is one death that has been associated with exposure to radiation.
And what about Fukushima?
Absolutely none. The doses were very much lower in Fukushima, so nobody has died from radiation poisoning.
What about the reports that have come out recently about the Japanese government paying compensation to the family of a man who died from lung cancer?
Yeah, I mean, the chances of him had that lung cancer from being exposed to radiation are infinitesimally small. But in a court of law, you don't have to prove cause. You just have to accept responsibility, which is a different thing.
Is Chernobyl, can people go there back there again? Is it still...
Actually, the government told everybody to leave, and then some people were like, this is our home. And within a year or two, they moved back, like, screw you. And the government was like, it's not really worth it. There are people who live in there today. And actually, because there's a smaller human presence, wildlife has flourished.
My name is Professor Jim Smith. I'm at the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences, and I study radiation in the environment. Did you know that the world's worst nuclear accident didn't have as big an environmental impact as we thought? I've been studying the animals in the exclusion zone around the Chernobyl nuclear power station, an area which was evacuated 30 years ago, and now wildlife's coming back. So we've studied populations of large mammals, so wolves, boar, elk, roe deer, in this area, and we find that the populations are similar to what we see in nature reserves in other parts of the region. Although we're saying that the wildlife's doing well at Chernobyl, this doesn't mean that the radiation's necessarily good for the ecosystem. It means that human habitation is probably worse. So people doing the things they do, farming, fishing, forestry, seem to have a worse effect on the ecosystem than the world's worst nuclear accident.
You would get a higher dose of radiation if you live there, and if there was a significant population, then there would statistically probably be a higher cancer rate, but ultimately wouldn't be uninhabitable. You could live in Chernobyl, and sure, it would increase your cancer rate a bit, but it's not a death zone.
Compared to like the pollution in cities that are normally found, it is exactly worse. The air pollution in cities. So you would actually be better off in Chernobyl than like living in Detroit.
And that's mainly because lung cancer is far more deadly than thyroid cancer. But if you can actually live in the Fukushima exclusion zone, and while your exposure would be higher than what is average for background radiation, you wouldn't exceed the annual exposure limit for a radiation worker.
Yeah.
So
you would actually get more radiation exposure if you were like an airline pilot.
Oh, well, a lot more in most cases.
Yeah.
Airline pilots actually are exposed to a fair bit of radiation. It's one of the more radiation-intense jobs that even exists.
If you're a smoker, you're gonna get about 2 to 3 times more. If you I think it's like a pack a day or half a pack a day.
Yeah.
You're gonna get 2 to 3 times more the annual limit for a radiation worker. If you're an astronaut, you'll get 3 or 4 times as much.
Do you know what Grand Central Station is in New York? It's a large granite building, and it is very fancy. And it's one of the biggest terminals. It's sort of a hub for the subway system. That being inside of that gives you a higher radiation dose per unit time than being in any operating nuclear reactor plant will.
I can go one better. There's an area, I believe it's in Iran. The background radiation, the natural background radiation, is like 300 microsieverts or per hour. I think it is. It's like something crazy. It's way higher than anywhere else in the world, and they do not have higher cancer incidence rates, like higher than average at all. In fact, there is a little bit of evidence, although it's limited, where they kind of tested people from this area to see their bodily responses to when exposed to more ionizing radiation, and they actually fared better than other people. So So I'm not saying that like radiation's good for you, but the limits that we have for exposure to radiation are overwhelmingly conservative. One of the more interesting takeaways from Chernobyl, and a little bit from Fukushima as well, is that people, governments that either are sensitive to public perception or they're just as misunderstood about the dangers of nuclear power as the general public, is they tend to have overly conservative responses. One that I remember was in Scotland. Some of the rain that actually made it all the way to Scotland was partially irradiated and irradiated the grass, which the sheep ate. Scotland was like, okay.
Oh, yeah.
And then they basically just destroyed every sheep farm in Scotland. Even though the amount of dose that one would have gotten from consuming this sheep wouldn't have statistically increased your chance of cancer. They were just like, oh, it's a detectable amount of radiation, and they just ruined a whole bunch of family farms and really just the availability of food in general. Yeah. Like after 3 Mile Island, the regulations ramped up, and they mainly increased. And they estimates I've seen that anywhere between doubling to quadrupling construction costs of nuclear plants with no measurable increase in safety. It was lots of ratcheting, like, oh, you need 41% more steel because of this little thing, but it's no safer than it was before.
It takes 12 years to build the plant because there are so many regulations. You want more?
Yes, actually, I do.
We could have clean power from nuclear plants if silly people like you weren't scaring people about the wrong things.
If you want to accuse us of having raised the cost of building new nuclear plants by demanding more regulation, I plead guilty.
The same thing with Fukushima. There was an evacuation once there was, notification of the accident, and they evacuated, like a lot of people in the surrounding area, but a lot of these individuals were elderly people that really shouldn't have been moved, or at least were more in danger of being moved. And the evacuation, if I remember the estimate correctly, led to about several hundred to 1,100 people killed from that. So the fear of nuclear very often leads to hurting more people than the threat of nuclear itself.
Yeah, it's also an interesting thing to note. Like you have what's called the Chernobyl Forum, which is like a collaboration between the UN and all like many different scientific experts who go into like the damage that Chernobyl caused. And one interesting line that comes from the forum says, the mental health impact of Chernobyl is the largest public health problem unleashed by the accident today. So it's not the radiation that's the biggest problem, it's the fear.
So what's the pros of nuclear energy? We talked about the cons a little bit.
Right.
The pros of nuclear energy is, compared to any other energy source, per unit energy liberated or gained from it, it kills fewer people. And then this is throughout its entire lifetime: mining, refining, construction, maintenance, decommissioning. It kills fewer people. It creates fewer CO2 equivalent. It takes up less land. It takes up less raw materials. It has the highest capacity factor, so it's the most reliable and the least in need of storage, and it's arguably the most efficient as well. One thing that is often overlooked is that it's easy to look at just the operation of a plant, but you have to consider what goes into the means to harness that energy. So you have to, like, for other sources, every single source, you have to mine more steel, more concrete, more silicon, what have you, to get the same amount of energy harnessing. And that means more occupational fatalities, accidents, more CO2 being emitted by your equipment, more transport of that material. Power density is king. That's why nuclear is so effective. It's not just effective in efficiency, but it's also effective in its use of resources, including the human cost.
So what does this mean, deaths per TWH?
So it's per unit energy, and I mean, worldwide, we'd probably measure it in petawatt hours, but terawatt hours are usually what the scale you see for larger industrialized countries.
Although I have to stress, like there are other figures that put nuclear power slightly higher than solar and wind.
I've seen those too. Those are the ones that don't account for the full life cycle. So when you count for mining, so a lot of deaths from solar are from installation and maintenance.
Yeah.
Like, especially rooftop solar, and same for wind. But when you account for the fact that you have to mine the silicon and you have to, you have to deal with cadmium telluride and thin film photovoltaics, the environmental impact that's often unseen is windmills kill a lot of birds. Now, the counterpoint to that, and it's a fair counterpoint, is that domestic cats kill far more birds than windmills. And that's absolutely true. It's like an order of magnitude more. But the kinds of birds that cats kill are often like songbirds or pigeons, whereas the kind of birds that windmills kills are like the bald eagle and the spotted owl. Like, they're large, often endangered birds.
Yeah, and don't forget the bats. Like, bats also really affected by wind turbines. Yeah.
And bats are an underappreciated aspect of the biome as well.
Like, look at all the jobs oil creates, and look at all the batteries for electrical cars and stuff.
I haven't heard. So oil does, like, everything creates jobs, but it's actually funny because from an efficiency standpoint, one that creates the fewest jobs for the same amount of energy is the most efficient one, because all the human capital that if you're going to tie up much more human capital in producing the same amount of energy, that means you're producing less of something else. And nuclear is the most efficient in that regard. Fossil fuels, it really comes down to power density. That's why fossil fuels also produce less jobs.
I don't think the point of energy production is to have a lot of jobs. Like, it's basically like farming, and I don't think farming should be the occupancy of like a lot of people from the public. So it should be like really small, high energy dense, and not many people should be involved with it. So the point is not jobs. The point is just energy efficiency and less impact on the environment. That's the point of it.
Like, the idea that we should go for renewables because they create more jobs is the Luddite argument. Like,
Yeah.
the Luddite argument during the Industrial Revolution. Before the Industrial Revolution, 80% of people were farmers. Now it's 3%. But all that human capital was freed up to make other things. It's kind of the core catalyst to the Industrial Revolution, is by industrializing, you now are making more out of every unit of human work to improve people's lives. The second deadliest is hydro, and it's only, and if you in the U.S., I think it's like maybe hydro is 5 times as deadly, but if you look worldwide because of major dam collapses in China, it's like 50 times as deadly, but it's still less deadly than wind or solar, just because of how diffuse the energy sources are. Yeah, so the estimates for total deaths from Chernobyl, about 36 people died from the accident and the response. But then from like long-term cancer exposure, the estimates are very wildly. It's like 4,000 to 96,000, and that's largely because over time it's hard to distinguish. Well, you got older, you get more cancer, kind of thing. The Bankao dam collapse in China killed 110,000 people and displaced millions more. So but I think a more resonating example for the public would be just like look at plane crashes. When a plane crashes, you have hundreds of people die. But they're so more infrequent that overall, per mile traveled, it's safer.
Yeah, let's move on to the energy created by when the land was ruled by amphibians and insects, the Carboniferous carbon coal.
Okay.
I mean, it's much more dangerous and polluting.
If you calculate the amount of death caused by coal per year, then you would in order for nuclear to match it, you would need a Chernobyl level event every few weeks in order to match what is happening with coal.
Yeah.
I remember. I think if I remember the statistic correctly, anyway, is we could have a Chernobyl event every year, and nuclear would still be the safest energy source. Coal plants expose people to more radioactivity than nuclear plants because all of the trace uranium and polonium isotopes in the coal just go out with the ash.
This is also a point that I made in my video. Like if you nuclear power plants are heavily regulated and they aren't allowed to release a number of radiation into the environment. So if we apply the same regulatory standards on coal, then all coal plants will be shut down because of the radiation release alone. If you are scared about the radiation, go after coal, not nuclear power.
Yeah, it's true. Well, that's one of the things people forget is that it's not the case that fossil fuels aren't radioactive. They are. It's just that that's not the source that we're getting more from. We're burning them for chemical energy, but they're still radioactive because stuff from underground tends to be radioactive. Yeah, there are no completely safe mines.
Yeah,
right.
All mines are going to have injuries and problems. However, coal is amongst the most dangerous kind of mines out there.
And even if, for example, every material was equally safe to mine, if you have to mine more of it, you're going to have more accidents. So like if someone brings up, oh, mining uranium is dangerous like mining coal, well, so is mining silicon and aluminum and rare earth metals, like all the things you need. And
we don't have an option that doesn't involve mine injuries for humanity. Yeah. We have options that can mitigate how many we have, and nuclear is a huge one. If we could vastly reduce coal mining, and really, we could probably move entirely off of coal. Between natural gas and other renewables and nuclear, we probably don't actually need coal.
So when I hear natural disasters and stuff like that, a lot of people think about oil spills and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's never been a nuclear spill like that. So even in Fukushima, where radioactive isotopes were released to the ocean, the actual measurable effects in terms of like detriment to people or ecosystems were essentially zero from that event.
Yeah. How dangerous are oil spills?
Extremely. I mean, it depends on their size, obviously. If you take, an eyedropper and you put 4 drops of oil in the ocean, nothing's going to happen. But the big ones that we hear about, like the BP oil spill in the Gulf or the
Exxon
Valdez. Yeah, I mean, that can kill a huge portion of sea life for just a gigantic area. They are some of the worst disasters that happen in terms of ecological disasters. Now, they tend not to have a huge cost in human life, which, I mean, I guess that's a positive.
Yeah.
Not too many people tend to die, but they're still, I mean, the economic damage they cause can easily reach into the multiples of billions of dollars. Like the BP oil spill ruined a lot of people's livelihood just based on the fact that it ruined their fishing businesses.
Yeah, I have a question about nuclear. Did they have the same problem as oil and coal as there's limited supply of it?
That is highly debatable. So there's about enough uranium in the crust right now to power the entire world, for about 230 years at current consumption using light water reactors, if I remember the statistic correctly. Mm-hmm. But there's enough uranium in the ocean, which currently is not economically viable to extract, to power the entire world for 60,000 years. But there's 3 times as much thorium in the crust as there is uranium, and thorium has lots of advantages over uranium as a nuclear fuel.
Okay.
Even if it isn't technically renewable, it's definitely sustainable.
Yeah.
For the long term. In fact, by the time we're really, if we switch to primarily nuclear, by the time we're running out of uranium, we probably would be reaching other problems, or we'd be colonizing other planets.
Speaking of nuclear waste, a lot of cartoons in the 80s and 90s talked about how it damages the environment, like Captain Planet and The Simpsons and stuff.
My name is Duke Nukem. I'm a nuclear shark. I'm hotter than Elvis, and I glow in the dark.
Well, Captain Planet was for kids for a reason. So The Simpsons absolutely, I think, has done some helped at least reinforce the perception that nuclear power is unsafe.
So is nuclear waste dangerous, or that people?
Okay, so there's many different kinds of nuclear waste. So there's long-lived waste, and there's short-lived waste. And So the short-lived waste is like strontium-90, cesium-137. They last 30 years or less. And the higher actinides, they're radioactive for a very long time. And this picture does not show, like Palo Verde, like many nuclear plants, stores their waste on site. They keep the rods in large pools for a couple years. But the other thing about nuclear waste, in 70 years, roughly, of all hundreds of nuclear plants operating at any one time in the U.S., all of this unused fuel that will last millions of years can fit inside of a football field if stacked 3 meters high. Like, it's a very small amount of waste that's very easy to control. Oh, it's radioactive. Okay, well, yeah, but we have shielding, so...
Yeah. So is there any way to use that waste for anything else, or is it just useless?
Well, it's not that it's... Okay, so nuclear waste can be used... in a small amount of it is used in nuclear medicine.
In my country, we have two nuclear plants. Like, one produces electricity, and one is like a really important medical or nuclearite generator.
So light water reactors were chosen. Like, so the reason why we use light water reactors, the main reason is Admiral Rickover. Admiral Rickover was essentially the father of the nuclear navy, and he chose a light water reactor because it was much more space efficient, and like it was safer than a boiler water reactor because it's a pressurized water reactor, and it was mainly for submarines. They're not very efficient. They are not the most efficient at all. So. Roughly 90 to 95% of the usable fuel over the core lifetime is not used in light water reactors. Much of that fuel can be recycled into MOX fuel, which is like a combination of uranium and plutonium, although it's becoming not really economical to do so anymore. But it can also be used in fast reactors. Fast reactors are basically breeder reactors. Instead of relying on thermal neutrons, they use fast neutrons. The integral fast reactor was developed in the 80s, and it's a breeder reactor. It's a fast reactor, but it was designed with safety being numero uno. And so instead of having a coolant loop, it has a coolant pool. The core is designed geometrically where the fuel has far more room to expand when heated. The fuel can expand as it gets heated to the point where it can actually creates a much stronger, like we talked about the negative feedback loop for heat. It's much stronger in this one.
Our goal was to design a new type of reactor where the very physics of it would be such that it could withstand almost any type of accident that nuclear plants can be subject to. It was called the IFR, the Integral Fast Reactor.
They actually tested it. This was in the 80s. They had a working prototype, and they designed and built a working prototype in less than 4 years. They actually did a test called all-station blackout, which is what happened at Fukushima. They obviously didn't predict what happened at Fukushima, but all-station blackout is where you lose all utility power. You lose all power from your steam generators. Your diesels don't start. Any batteries you have, like you have zero power to pump coolant through any of your heat exchangers. They did that. They all-station blackout, and then they also disabled any kind of manual interventions and disabled all of the safeties, like for scrams and stuff like that. So this is the worst case scenario. Nothing can save you.
This experiment was almost a direct parallel to what happened at Fukushima. It was eerily similar.
We ran a reactor at full power, disabled the shutdown system, so the operators had no ability to shut the reactor down. And we shut off the cooling system. Didn't extract the heat, so we just let things get hotter. In most reactors, you can't do it. No reactor I know of would survive that accident, but you have a meltdown.
The international audience were watching the temperature going up like that, straight up. They turned around like so to see if I was or if the Argonne guys were running. By the time they looked up again, the trace had turned like so, and it was on its way down, and the reactor just quietly shut itself down.
They just saw the temperature go up and up and up, and then it reached an inflection point and shut itself down.
No action required of the operators, no action required of the safety systems, nothing. You could just stand back like this, watch the dials if you wished, and the reactor shut itself down. All major reactor accidents happen because of one thing: inadequate cooling. The IFR type reactor, which EBR-2 was a prototype for, if you cut it off from the steam system so it cannot reject its heat, it will just shut itself down.
So it can't melt down?
No, it can't melt down.
It cannot melt down. It was designed that way. And there's also liquid salt reactors that can't melt down because it's already molten.
Yeah,
but
molten salt, lifter. Yeah,
lifters are like a. I often dream about lifters. No, but there's also because of the integrated aspect of it. It's integrated in that they reprocess the fuel on site with electrorefinery. So over the lifetime of a particular core, it produces no long-lived waste. Now you don't have to redistribute the fuel for processing elsewhere. It mitigates the effect of potential for proliferation, like if something gets stolen or anything. This, in my opinion, answered the three primary political concerns of over nuclear power, and environmentalists still opposed it. The program was near its completion, and Bill Clinton killed it in '93 on recommendation from his energy secretary, who was an ex-fossil fuel lobbyist.
Now let me frame this debate, if I may, by reading a letter from the President of the United States sent to me yesterday. Thank you for your letter supporting our decision to terminate the Department of Energy's Advanced Liquid Metal Reactor program, including the integral fast reactor. I want to assure you that this administration does not support the IFR and will oppose any efforts to continue the funding for this reactor project.
The IFR program was shut down, and the project went down the black hole of government politics.
About your fast breeder reactor that can use nuclear waste as more fuel. So basically we have a huge fuel repository which can last for I don't know how long we can last on just the waste that we already have.
Now all of that can be used in advanced reactors to power everything in the United States at today's level, everything, including the transportation sector, for 1,000 years. For 1,000 years without ever mining a gram of uranium again.
That actually is not only for our waste, but also some statistics indicate that increased nuclear energy proliferation leads to more dismantling of existing nuclear weapon stockpiles to use as fuel, because it's already refined. Why would we bother refining more nuclear fuel? So let's just take what we have here. So there is one thing: you can't go 100% nuclear because. You can't go 100 because you'll have a lot of redundant capacity, and you'll have your capacity factor actually goes down if you have too much. And if seen like what happens in France and South Korea, it seems like 80% is the inflection point. Once you start going past 80, your capacity factor starts going down. But it's still, I mean, it's 92% right now, and then followed by geothermal and at 85 and hydro at 75, where wind and solar are both below 50. Solar is the worst. It's at 25. Thermal solar is 23. It's like a pet project in the middle of the desert. People like to say enough energy hits the earth in this amount of time to power the entire world. But it doesn't really matter how much energy is hitting the earth. Because the sun's energy is effectively unlimited, but the means to harness it isn't, and so now it's immediately a question of trade-offs: raw materials, land, where you can use it. There is one of the nice things about fossil fuels as well as nuclear is that your fuel source, you can mine it in one place, ship it off, and use it where it needs to be used. You can't ship sunlight. You can't ship wind. You got to build where it is. And the largest power plant in the country is a nuclear plant. It's the Palo Verde nuclear plant in Arizona. It's in the middle of the desert. It has no natural cooling source. It's actually cooled by treated sewage water. Mm-hmm. It's like 3.9 gigawatts. It's 3 reactors. The whole site takes about 4,000 acres. Security, they have 2 weeks worth of water storage, and if you took that entire footprint of 4,000 acres and turned it into a solar farm, you would get about 1/8 of the amount of power produced annually than that plant produces. It's not a small difference. Nuclear is just slightly better. The diffuse and unreliable nature of solar is I think utility grade solar is just awful in like every way. It's the dirtiest, it's the deadliest, it's the least efficient, it's the least reliable. It's
even have some uses like in like really high desert environment, maybe.
Yeah, like where other energy sources might not be, you couldn't really utilize as well. So the advantage of residential solar is that you're not taking up more space. Your roof is just there. Why not just make use of it, kind of thing? And you can supplement your own power consumption. But to rely on it for utility grade solar to just power everybody, and it's important to remember that a significant portion of the energy grid is powering industry. It's powering factories. It's powering chemical plants. They don't have footprints big enough to power themselves from their own solar, and they operate 24/7. So unless you want to greatly expand storage, which itself increases cost and increases carbon footprints, then you really shouldn't be relying on solar. Now thermal solar is interesting in that it's usually a liquid salt, and you can actually store it and then use it later. But thermal solar, the problem is that it takes a huge amount of land, and it's still very inefficient. So, I mean, I don't have any problem with rooftop solar, other than the fact that, like, okay, you're now taking advantage of space that's already occupied, but you can't rely on that. That's just for your home.
Yeah.
If you have a skyscraper apartment that has 10,000 people in it, but its footprint's only a city block.
Yeah.
The rooftop's not going to be able to power. It might be able to power a floor or two, and that's it. Peak hours are usually between, I think, if I remember correctly, it's like, at least in the U.S., it might be different in the Netherlands. It's like 6, basically, when everybody gets home from work, turns on all their lights, their devices, turns on their AC or their heating. Like, more people are home during that time than at any other point in the day at the same time. And
that's when demand becomes really high. Yeah.
Not only that, but the one thing that I think is often overlooked as well is let's say we just, with an expansion of electric vehicles, material bottlenecks notwithstanding, is that now charging vehicles overnight, that's going to shift where the peak is, and it's going to get further and further away from daylight hours or peak wind hours as well.
Outside of a few places, one of them being like the Sonoran Desert, another one being like parts of like the Atacama Desert or something. Building a solar plant is the same thing as building a natural gas or oil plant, because you're going to have one of those to make up for lean times in the solar energy production.
There's the intermittency problem. And so if you depend on these sources, you have to have some way of getting energy during those time periods that it's not available.
During the day, we generate as much electricity as we can using solar. At night, and when it's cloudy, we use more natural gas. Each year, we probably get over 200 days of sunshine, but there's 165 more days without. As big as this solar plant is, it's not enough to meet our customers' needs. The plant operates 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. That's why we need natural gas.
Whether it's wind or solar, everybody is looking at gas as the supplementary fuel. The plants that we're building, the wind plants and the solar plants, are gas plants.
Yeah, so solar is not competing with fossil fuels. It is helping the expansion of fossil fuels, because there are virtually no places on Earth where you can where you can even make the majority of your power from solar with it.
Now, natural gas, like if you're going to do fossil fuels, natural gas is probably the way to go. It does have issues in that it's primarily methane, which does have a stronger a radiative forcing effect on the heat of the atmosphere. But its residency period in the atmosphere is much lower because methane reacts with all sorts of things. CO2 doesn't, but nonetheless, it's overall cleaner.
It was originally. They got by hunting whales before they found them underground.
Whale oil is a little different, but funnily enough, whale oil was rendered essentially obsolete with the invention of kerosene. At least, or not the invention of kerosene and making it efficiently by Rockefeller. But that's a different oil, yeah.
The oil industry did, to some extent, save whales from going extinct as a group.
Right.
So it should be noted that the fossil fuels are very energy dense, and it was kind of a necessary evil to transition into what we have in the modern age. It greatly improved the quality of life of humanity. It just at a great cost. As technologies advanced, we can maintain and increase that quality of life without enduring that cost anymore. The climate change notwithstanding, transitioning away from fossil fuels has a lot of great positives because air quality will improve.
Hopefully, the history of humanity will end up being finding a convenient but not very good energy source and then eventually using it to find a better one and adopting that one until the next better one comes along. Right now, we're in a weird spot, though, where the next better one is blindingly obvious.
It's one thing to say no more expansion of nuclear. If you're for shutting down nuclear plants, if you have a perfectly fine operating nuclear plant, like the one in Diablo Canyon in California, where California would just refuse to renew the license, that's just a horrible idea. It's efficient, it's clean, it's already been built, and the same thing in Vermont. Bernie Sanders helped spearhead the shutting down. I can't remember the name of the plant, and I remember many years ago. Bernie Sanders, when he was on the, maybe he's still on it, when he was on the energy committee, he said 99.99% safe is not safe enough. It's like, that means that no energy safe is safe enough.
In 2011, California shut down San Onofre Nuclear Generation Station. Those opposed to nuclear power painted a picture of solar and wind replacing it. What ended up filling the gap was the combustion of natural gas. In 2014, the Vermont Yankee nuclear station was shut down. It was the 5th largest source of electricity for New England. It sure looks like the people trying to shut it down thought it would be replaced by renewables. Instead, it was replaced by burning oil and coal. Nuclear plants close, resulting in more combustion and more pollution. The only beneficiaries were those providing the alternate source of power. In the case of San Onofre, alternate sources of power were provided to California by its parent corporation, Edison International. In the case of Entergy's Vermont Yankee, alternate power was provided to New England by a natural gas power plant owned by Entergy Wholesale Commodities.
Well, what we see all around the world is that when a gap arises, it is filled by thermal plant, by coal and gas. And indeed, that, as Carl pointed out in his introduction, is the head-on competition we are now facing at the moment. This is what we now see in Germany, where what they claim to be doing is replacing, is a massive rollout of renewables. That's what they are doing. But what they're doing with it is replacing nuclear rather than replacing fossil fuels. And it seems to me like absolute madness, faced with the climate crisis that we are facing, to be replacing one form of low-carbon electricity with another. That is not where the fight lies. The fight lies in getting fossil fuels out of our economy.
I think the main reason is what Ness kind of touched on earlier, is that it's essentially risk perception. You see a windmill, you see a solar plant, they seem very innocuous. You didn't see everything that went into making it. Even a hydro dam is pretty static and just spitting out some water through its but you see a nuclear plant, even in its cooling tower, billing out all this. They think it's smoke, but it's just steam, because CO2 is colorless. You can't see CO2.
Yeah.
So, and then also like the negative associations in the past. But like, the whole human first thing is very, like, for me, it's just like whoever's saying that is either very malinformed or just tone deaf. Because if it's humans first, then why are you favoring energy sources that kill more people?
Helen Caldicott. I don't know if you're familiar with her.
I'm not.
Somebody. I know, like she's like one of the leading anti-nuclear activists, and she promoted using candles in the replacement of light bulbs.
Well, Mozart and Shakespeare wrote by candlelight. Ooh, candlelight. I'm writing an article for the International Herald Tribune now about the future of nuclear power, and I ended it by saying that.
That's a terrible idea. That's that is directly pumping carbon dioxide into the air in a way that light bulbs don't do. Light bulbs, an incandescent light bulb is going to cause way less carbon dioxide emission than burning a candle. It's not even a competition. And if you use like an LED, it's going to be like an order of magnitude less on top of that because they use so much less power anyway. Look, guys, use candles for accents or if the power goes out.
Also, she said that
more people have died from Chernobyl than in the Black Plague. Then we extrapolate through to Japan. Japan is, by orders of magnitude, many times worse than Chernobyl.
Those are patently false. Now, Fukushima
this is flat Earth or creationist level wrong.
According to her, Chernobyl and them killed more than a third of Europe's population.
Well, she probably is trying to mean in absolute numbers, so she probably wouldn't say that, but still, it would mean that it would have had to have killed millions of people, and it didn't. Even if we give very, very pessimistic estimates, it's very hard to get it to having killed even 1,000 people.
My quick Google yielded the Black Plague in absolute numbers estimated 25 million deaths.
Yeah.
So she's off by at least 2 orders of magnitude.
At least. It's probably more like 3.
During presentation, she used like this chart of like the cloud from Fukushima going to like the US.
The fallout map that Caldecott is using was a joke. The website Snopes, famous for rooting out and reporting hoaxes, has a page on this map declaring that it is a hoax. The Australian Radiation Service expressly denies that they published the map. A reason why this is obviously a hoax is it says the western United States will receive 750 rads of radiation. However, it only takes between 250 and 400 rads to kill 50% of the people exposed. So this dose the West Coast was supposedly going to receive, and which Caldecott seems to think did receive, should have in fact killed most of the people on the West Coast.
It has been debunked since 2011, and she's still using it many years later. Like the common understanding of radiation among the public is really, really bad. Like when you say radiation to somebody, they will often freak out. And when somebody learns that like their iPhone emits radio waves, and the 5G scare recently about COVID-19. Oh my god! I found like a Greenpeace website which explains, quote unquote, explains radiation, and it lists like a few types, and it says, oh, you have like heat radiation, and you have solar radiation, you have nuclear radiation, and nuclear radiation is bad because it can cause damage, but heat radiation and solar radiation cannot cause damage.
Yeah, I'll tell you what. Let me go stand naked in the sunlight for a few days and see how much damage isn't caused. Oh, and the thermal radiation can't hurt you? I'm sorry. Have you not heard of just being burned? Stick your hand in a fire if you don't think thermal radiation will hurt you. Yeah.
Like as Ness pointed out, like the perception of the dangers of nuclear, the public can be forgiven for not really understanding it, because the units are completely non-intuitive. What's a becquerel? What's a sievert? Right?
Yeah.
So, but yeah, the education is really been mostly misinformation from an oddly uncoordinated but odd bedfellows effort by both fossil fuel companies and environmentalists.
I don't know if you've seen the documentary Pandora's Promise. Maybe are you familiar with that?
Oh, I love that movie. Yeah.
Yeah. Like it shows like a pamphlet from like a go solar, not nuclear, and it was sponsored by a oil company or something.
Solar, not nuclear. Yeah.
Sponsored by the Will Heat Institute.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. You don't need a furnace, just have solar panels. This is the cynicism of the fossil fuel industry.
From Pandora's Promise, my favorite moment in it is there's this one instance where the documentary is looking at an anti-nuclear protest, and one of the guys, I think he was part of the protest. He goes like, hey, it's like a snack break, and he starts handing out bananas. And so in the nuclear industry, there is banana for scale, because bananas are a nice way for because there's a small percentage of the potassium in bananas is radioactive. It's potassium 40. That is a nice way of scaling the dosage you would get. I think it's 0.1 microsieverts. I think that's what a banana is. I might be wrong on the unit there. He started handing out bananas. And it was just like, wow, those people will probably get more radiation from eating that banana than they will from being outside that nuclear plant protesting it.
There was one time when Greenpeace made a pamphlet, but they accidentally put out an early draft, And in the early draft that they put out accidentally, it says, and I quote, "In the 20 years since the Chernobyl tragedy, the world's worst nuclear accident, there have been nearly fill in alarmist and Armageddonist factoid here." What?
That's amazing. That sounds like it was made by fossil fuel companies and fed to them. That warms my heart.
As I always say, never stop learning and enjoy the randomness. We'll see you all next time. Bye.